Altså ikke bare være brei I sine interesser, men også være brei I hvem man virkelig kan gå I faglig dialog med. Og hatt debatter med, altså, ikke bare sånne personer som Christopher Hitchens og Richard Dawkins, men også et sånn bredt spekter av biologer, fysikere, filosofer, teologer som altså Lawrence Krauss og Peter Atkins, Peter Stenger, Stephen Law, store kjente navn. Han skriver fortsatt bøker, skrev nå nettopp en om determinisme, slipper en til neste, slipper en over nyttår nå, med titel Can Science Explain Everything? Og det dette feltet vi nå befinner oss, vitenskap og religion. So, John Lennox, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your warm welcome. This is my first time in Kristiansand, and I have been admiring the beauty of your country on the way here. And it's an honor to be invited to your university to speak on a topic that I only just rightly understood a few days ago when I reread the invitation letter. That the title was, Can We Believe in God in a Naturalistic World? Now, I have no idea what a naturalistic world is. And I suspect nor have you, because there's no such thing. What there is a naturalistic way of looking at the world. We're talking about interpretations of reality. And that little subtle difference made me add some slides. So I'm going to give you the academic warning. And that is that some of the citations I have not been able to check accurately sitting on trains and in hotel bedrooms in your country. So that being said, let us think of naturalism. Naturalism is normally associated in people's minds. It is a worldview. It is a way of looking at things. But it is associated with several basic ideas. First of all, science. Secondly, the atomic theory of reality. Thirdly, scientism, the idea that science is the only way to truth. And finally, for the moment, determinism. And if we start with the past president and founder of the Humanist Society, he says that what is common to naturalistic philosophy is its commitment to science. Indeed, naturalism might be defined in its more general sense as the philosophical generalizations of the methods and conclusions of the sciences. So that's tying a worldview very close to the natural sciences. And Massimo Pigliucci, he confirms this by saying that the basic assumption of science is what? That the world can be explained entirely in physical terms without recourse to godlike entities. That is not the basic assumption of science. That is the basic assumption of naturalistic science, because it closes down the kind of things you can use to understand the world. He wants to do it in terms of atoms. And of course, the atomic hypothesis is a work of sheer ancient genius. And Richard Feynman, who always puts things well, as a Nobel Prize winner in physics should, all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. And if we go back in time to 460 BC, we come to Democritus. And he once said, I understand, by convention is sweet. He's describing things. By convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, but by verity. In other words, we can describe various aspects of things. But what are they actually? Two things: atoms and the void. Now, the naturalistic view of the universe is very closely related to the materialistic view. They're not quite the same, although even the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, I'm glad to say, manages not to separate them very carefully. Some naturalists are materialists, but not all materialists are naturalists, and they make some kind of separation between immaterial ideas and entities and material ones. But Democritus had this idea that if you think about reality, and one of the basic worldview questions that all of us have is this: what is your idea of ultimate reality? What is the really real? And he suggested the really real is two things. There's empty space and atoms falling down through it. And as they fall down through empty space, they collide together, they form galaxies, stars, and all the usual stuff that we get from any contemporary cosmologists. And the idea has been very fertile. We got to realize this was a genius of an idea. I'm not mentioning this idea to ridicule it. I'm mentioning it for the opposite reason. Because what it has produced historically is nothing short of spectacular. You can look down the left-hand column and you can think of the atoms, the little particles, which led to atomic theory, and then subatomic theory, and then electrons, protons, neutrons, and so to quantum theory, the Standard Model, the Higgs boson, and so on. It has been scientifically, brilliantly fruitful. And then there's the void, empty space. What is empty space? No such thing, says Stephen Hawking, but we might come to that later. But Newton and his gravitation, Faraday and Clerk Maxwell and their electromagnetic fields, Einstein and his gravitational fields, these increasingly sophisticated notions of what we mean by the void. But in the ancient world, Democritus was not the only thinker. And one of my great intellectual heroes is Socrates. And Socrates put the choice, because you had Democritus and Leucippus on the one side, the atomists, the materialists. But then on the other side, you have people like Plato, who said, yes, there is material, but there's transcendence. There's more. There are the gods or there is God. And here was the choice, as Socrates put it in the Philebus of Plato. Whether all this, which they call the universe, is left to the guidance of unreason and chance medley, or, on the contrary, as our fathers have declared, ordered and governed by a marvelous intelligence and wisdom. And for the purposes of our lecture today, those are the two main possibilities. And that is that the universe has not got a mind backing it, or the universe has a mind backing it. Now, it's interesting, even in recent days, to see naturalism being heavily questioned by atheist intellectuals. Thomas Nagel is probably the most famous. We'll come to him in a bit. But he says the priority given to evolutionary naturalism in the face of its implausible conclusions. Gosh, that was a dangerous thing to write. Just look at cyberspace to see what people have said about that. Is due, I think, now listen to this, the secular consensus that this is the only form of external understanding of ourselves that provides an alternative to theism. So what he's suggesting is naturalism is not so much driven because of its consistency with scientific evidence, but rather because it appears at least to provide an alternative to theism. So that leads me to rephrase the question at the top of this lecture. Can we believe in God in a scientific world? But ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure at this university you believe in balance. The balancing question is this: can we believe in science in a naturalistic world? That's the question that's not frequently asked, because the presumption is, in an academy that's dominated by naturalism, that that's the only option. I think it's increasingly becoming less the only option. And one of the world's most distinguished philosophers is ALVIN Plantinga. And he makes this shrewd observation: the alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. There is real concord. The alleged concord between science and atheism is superficial. There is real conflict. So there are two sides of the issue. And my object today is simply to give you some evidence, some of which may be new, some may not, and simply encourage you to make up your own minds, as sensible university students always do. Now, where do we get evidence from here? First of all, we know something about intellectual history. I've mentioned something very brief. And in a lecture like this, we have to be very brief. But since naturalism has virtually been conflated with science at the beginning, we better start by asking, where did modern science come from? In the sense of historically. Well, we know the answer to that. People like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Clerk Maxwell. You'll see I've put Euler in there, ladies and gentlemen. Euler was a mathematician. And so am I, and at least I want to feel somewhat at home in this group of people. But all of them were believers in God. Now that's a very interesting thing historically, because it's simply a fact. And historians of science and proper historians investigate these things. What had, if anything, their faith in God got to do with their science? Well, the naturalists would say, of course, that's a babyhood stage, and we understand that, but we've now grown out of it. But was it more than that? Well, the first philosopher I ever tried to read with great difficulty at the age of 15 was Professor Sir Alfred North Whitehead. I later came across C.S. Lewis's comment on him. Professor Whitehead, says Lewis, points out that centuries of belief in a God who combined the personal energy of Jehovah with the rationality of a Greek philosopher first produced that firm expectation of systematic order which rendered possible the birth of modern science. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. This is, to my mind, extremely important, because it means that faith in God didn't hinder the rise of modern science. It was actually the motor that drove it. And therefore, for those people at least, the alleged conflict between science and theism is extremely superficial indeed. And we need to bear that in mind. But let's come back to the major thing. I said naturalism is a way of looking at the world. So is theism. They are worldview interpretations. And of course, the impression is, in many universities, and particularly in mine, that there's a real conflict between science and theism nevertheless. But you can dismiss that very simply, just by thinking about a couple of Nobel Prize winners, and there are several pairs you could take. Stephen Weinberg on the left and Charles Townes on the right. Both geniuses at physics. Both have reached Nobel Prize level. You can't go higher than that. Now, let's see what we can deduce from that. First of all, what differentiates those men is not their physics. It's not their ability at science. And it's not their scientific reputation. What is it then? It's their worldview. Weinberg is an atheist. Townes was a Christian. So this is very interesting to me, because if science and theism were incompatible, and science and naturalism much more compatible, you would expect every single Nobel Prize winner to be an atheist. That isn't true. And as far as I can check, I would like someone to check it a bit more accurately. In the century between 1900 and 2000, over 60% of Nobel Prize winners believed in God. Now, the big question that arises out of this is, what is the real relationship between the naturalism people believe and the science they practice, or between the theism they believe and the science they practice? Which comes first? Or can either one come first? Well, let's have an example where naturalism comes first. This is another Nobel Prize winner. I'm not an agnostic, I'm an atheist. My attitude is not based on science, but rather on faith. Notice his use of faith. We'll come back to that. The absence of a creator, the non-existence of God, is my childhood faith, my adult belief, unshakable and holy, although it's not quite clear, the absence of a creator, what holy means. That's Klein. Now let me introduce someone from the other side. Now you've never heard of this chap, but forgive me, I'm Irish, and this is our only Nobel Prize winner for physics in Ireland. E.T.S. Walton, mind you, he made a major contribution to splitting the atom with Cockcroft. He was no mean physicist. Here's what Walton wrote. One way to learn the mind of the creator is to study his creation. We must pay God the compliment of studying his work of art, and this should apply to all realms of human thought. A refusal to use our intelligence honestly is an act of contempt for him who gave us that intelligence. Notice the huge difference in worldview between Klein and Walton. So what we've got in our world, ladies and gentlemen, we've got atheists who do stunning physics. We've got Christians who do stunning physics. It's not physics that's going to decide between them, is it? So we need to think hard about this question. What is the real relationship between science and worldview? So there's science up at the top, and there's theism on the right, and then a group of things that are related: materialism, physicalism, naturalism, and scientism. If the conflict is only apparent, what fuels it? And I want to suggest some of the things that make this situation much more difficult to discuss than it need be. The first one's the obvious, that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. When Stephen Hawking says God doesn't exist, or Dawkins says, that isn't a statement of science, it's a statement of their own belief. And I love this thing by Richard Feynman. I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy. Now, I want you to apply that to me, because that's only fair. You see, in a lecture like this, I am not, and thank the Lord for it, I am not talking to you about pure mathematics, or else the rose would have emptied long ago. So I'm actually talking outside my own academic discipline. Now, that's fine, provided we tread carefully, and provided we check our sources. We all do it. We've got to do it. Otherwise, life would be spectacularly boring. But we've got to remember that we can be just as dumb as the next guy when we go outside our field. So that's the first thing. The second thing, well, the second group of things, if I put them together, which make it difficult, are, first of all, there's a confusion about what faith means. There's a failure to recognize that science has limits. And there's a confusion about the nature of explanation. Let's take faith first, because we saw George Klein talking about his holy faith as an atheist. What does faith mean? Well, here's a popular definition. Dawkins and co. believe this, a religious word that means believing where there's no evidence. Now that is not a definition of faith in any dictionary I know except Webster's dictionary. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. But you see, that is a definition of what most of us call blind faith. Because faith in English comes from the Latin word fides, which means trust and reliability. But you know that you have faith in many things. You have faith in those chairs you're sitting on at the moment. They might collapse for all you know. But you've enough evidence to trust them. Oh, you all turned up at the right time for this lecture. Why was that? Because you believed there was going to be a lecture. Not only did you believe it, you believed it on the basis of sufficient evidence to get your bodies moving, to neglect the other things you were doing, and I thank you for coming. But it was faith that brought the lot of you here. It's lovely to have such people of faith with me this afternoon. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, we all exercise faith all the time in every area of our lives. And if we're sensible, we check out the evidence. You don't trust everybody, do you? Your bank manager might one day not trust you, unfortunately, because you couldn't give him enough evidence. That is, we all know what evidence-based faith is, except for Richard Dawkins and a number of other people, because they have willfully, and I say that advisedly, redefine faith as blind faith so that they can say about people like me, you know, John Lennox, well, poor chap, you know, he's a man of faith, which means one of the biggest insults you can get these days, because he's saying, Lennox, no point in talking to him because he believes where there's no evidence. Now, this is utterly misleading and dangerously false in two simultaneous directions. Because you see, the first one is, we think that science is evidence-based, and we hope it is. But the fiction that has got around is that Christianity is not evidence-based. That is totally false. And you can see it from one of the central statements in the fourth gospel. Now, Jesus did many other signs. They were supernatural signs, actually, which challenges some other things, in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But now notice this. But these are written so that you might believe. In other words, John is saying, here's evidence on which you can base evidence-based faith in three things. That Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of God, and then that you can have an experience based on it, that by believing you may have life in his name. Christianity is an evidence-based faith. And that's why I'm sitting here. Because if I didn't think that, I would have forgotten it all long ago. But now the other thing that's obscured by the bad definition of faith is that faith is essential to science. Einstein pointed that out so clearly. And he talks about science is done by people that are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. That's good stuff in a so-called postmodern world, by the way, but that's another thing. This source of feeling springs from the sphere of religion. To this there also belongs the faith. Please notice that. This is Einstein. The faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is comprehensible to reason. I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that profound faith. Just as all of you here are people of faith for all sorts of different reasons, a scientist, indeed any intellectual, doing any discipline in any university, ask them why they're doing it, and they'll tell you they believe it can be done. They have faith that it can be done. Now, in the field of the natural sciences, you can be more precise. You can say, I've got to believe before I do any mathematics that the universe is rationally intelligible. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother doing it. So it's not my mathematics that's telling me it's intelligible. It's that I'm saying it's intelligible, so I do my mathematics. That was the founding faith of Newton and Galileo and all the rest of them. That is where they started. So what does this sum up to? That faith is essential in every scientific discipline. So this idea that faith is believing where there's no evidence is desperately misleading. And we need to clear that out of our intellectual systems before we begin to think of this stuff at all. But now there's another danger with science. You can have too much faith in it. So let's look about faith in science from another perspective. This is scientism that is very closely connected often with naturalistic belief. The idea that science is the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell, although he didn't actually believe in scientism, once formulated it beautifully. Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attainable by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, I know it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's very late for logic, but let's have a go at this. You see, that statement sounds very impressive, but it's not a statement of science. What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. So if it's true, it's got to be false, hasn't it? Have you got that? Well, never mind. It's logically incoherent. Now, this is going too far. But there are several loud voices. One has just ceased, Stephen Hawking, brilliant genius. He believed in scientism. So does Dawkins, and so do many others. But to bring us back down to earth, there's Sir Peter Medawar. That there is indeed a limit on science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer. Here they are. Such questions as how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Questions that children ask. And Medawar, who also, by the way, won the Nobel Prize, says it's not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. And that is why this is a university. You see, if it was true that science, the natural sciences, are the only way to truth, you'd have to shut half the faculties in Agder University tomorrow. There'd be no history, there'd be no literature, there'd be no languages, there'd be no art, there'd be no music, there'd be nothing. There'd only be the natural sciences. And therefore you'd have no answers to the questions that the sciences cannot address. Now this is crucially important. This is not special pleading, ladies and gentlemen. This is the heart of the intellectual endeavor. Natural sciences have been very successful. Why? Because they ask a limited range of questions. We need the humanities. We desperately need the humanities. It was Einstein who said, and I'll come back to it, that the scientist is a poor philosopher. And I'm afraid Stephen Hawking was an example of one. Just listen to this. Now, I respect him greatly. I remember him at Cambridge. And as far as mathematical ability goes, Stephen Hawking is light years ahead of me. So make no mistake about that. But here's what he wrote. Traditionally, these are the questions I've just read out to you. What's the point of living? These are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It's what? You just imagine Cambridge Department of Philosophy when they read that. There was a huge controversy. But not only is philosophy dead, philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Now here's the scientism bit. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Now, when I first read that, I thought, how odd. He says early on in the book that philosophy is dead, but what's the topic of the book? Wait for it, the philosophy of science. Well, Stephen Hawking's dead, and we mourn his passing. But I was very impressed by the honesty of one of his friends, Lord Rees, Astronomer Royal in our country. And he had the courage to say this, and I think it helped many people to put Hawking into perspective. Brilliant mathematician, but now he goes out of his subject. And what did Rees say? He said, I know Stephen very well. He knows little philosophy and no theology, and we should not take seriously anything he says on either of those two. Now, that was a very courageous statement to say, essentially, at the funeral of someone. But it puts things back into proportion. I was very glad of that. It didn't demean Hawking. In my view, he's a genius anyway. But it puts the thing straight. Not everything that a scientist says is a statement of science, and therefore it doesn't have authority. But nevertheless, when it came, it shook many people. Hawking, who sat in Newton's chair in Cambridge, God didn't create the universe. And one of the ways of investigating this briefly is to ask ourselves, Newton, probably the greatest scientist who ever lived, believed in God. He studied gravity. In fact, he discovered it. Hawking doesn't believe in God, and he studies gravity too. So there's one man responsible for gravity who's a believer, and another man who does black holes and all this kind of stuff, and he doesn't believe in God. How do you sort that out? So I started thinking as to how I'd sort it out. And it seems to me there are three areas. There's logic, there's ideas about God, and ideas about explanation. So let's come to Stephen's, one of his central statements in his book. He talks about the scale of the entire universe. The positive energy of the matter can be balanced by the negative gravitational energy, and so there's no restriction on the creation of whole universes. And then comes this key. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And when I saw that, I thought, now that's a very interesting thing. Because there is a law like gravity, that is because there is something. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. That, in my book, is the beginnings of a contradiction, or at least it looks very much like it. And I thought it would be very interesting to investigate this a little bit more. What would you mean by a universe creating itself from nothing? Now, as you look at that statement, what is the thing in the statement that looks like nothing? Well, there's nothing looks like nothing, but there's something looks like zero. And that is the balance between positive and negative gravitational forces. And I began to think, is there just surely there can't be the possibility of a confusion between nothing and zero. Because what would it mean, a universe creating itself from zero? You see, he's talking about zero balance of gravitational forces. A simple analogy. You may find yourself in some stage in life, I hope you don't, where your assets exactly match your debts. And your measure financially is zero. But that doesn't mean you don't exist. That doesn't mean you're nothing. It simply means one measure of where you're at the moment is zero. But loads of things are happening, as is happening when there are positive and negative gravitational forces. It's not nothing. Because nothing, to most of us, is a philosophical concept, which means absence of anything. I went downtown in Kristiansand and I met nobody. Doesn't mean I met somebody called nobody. It means I didn't meet anybody. You got that? No. But anyway. So the next thing to investigate is nothing. Now, I've had great fun studying nothing. I even give lectures on nothing. It's amazing what you can get out of nothing. Well, it is. What would you do if you read this, written by a 12-year-old? Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? Now, this is written by an astrophysicist whom I have debated a couple of times. It's very puzzling because it's nonsense, of course. And I had the opportunity to debate Alan Guth. Alan Guth is probably the most brilliant cosmologist alive, the father of the theory of inflation, very rapid expansions phase after the Big Bang. And I was dying to ask him a question. It was in the MIT Harvard Faculty Club, which is a pretty formidable place. So when the time came for questions, I put my hand up, and Alan said, "Do you want to ask a question?" I said, "I really do." I said, "You know, in the public, people are really worried about nothing." He said, "Are they?" I said, "Tell me, when you as an astrophysicist talk about a universe coming from nothing, do you mean nothing in the philosophical sense of absence of anything?" He said, "Absolutely not." I said, "Thank you very much." You see, the claim is, ladies and gentlemen, God's not necessary because they got a universe from nothing. But they haven't got a universe from nothing. My belief in God doesn't depend on this, but it's very interesting to see that cosmology has forced people into the position where they've got to get a universe from nothing if naturalism is true. And they're failing spectacularly to do it if that is the kind of thing that they have to write. Now, of course, there's another question. What about these laws that appeared? What are they really? And this is Hawking again saying that the answer of the great scientist was that the work of God. And then he says this, "However, this is no more than a definition of God as an embodiment of the laws of nature, unless one endows God with some other attributes, such as being the God of the Old Testament. Employing God as a response merely substitutes one mystery for another. So if we involve God, the real crunch comes with the question, are there miracles, exceptions to the laws?" 2 parts there. And if I don't answer the second part and you want to ask me about miracles, please do afterwards. But you see, unless one endows God with some other attributes, well, why shouldn't one? I don't think he's right in saying that Kepler and Galileo and Descartes' answer was simply a definition of God as an embodiment of the laws of nature, because several of them believed in a personal God. And that wouldn't make sense. But passing that over, it means perhaps we better look at what the biblical view is. Now, the biblical view is that the universe was created by God from nothing physical. But there wasn't nothing in the first place. There was God, who is spirit, not material, not physical. So the biblical answer to the question is, there was God there, eternal, self-existent, and he created the universe. There was nothing physical involved in the beginning, and he upholds it by spirit. But the irony of today is that, see, I never thought we'd ever get to this, where the choice is between God and nothing for the origin of the universe. Keith Ward, one of my colleagues at Oxford, says if biblical theism is true, not only is matter not the only reality, it's not even the prime reality. There's at least one mind that's prior to all matter that brought everything into existence. So what I want you to do there is just begin to contrast the naturalistic worldview, starting with nothing, and a self-created universe. Remember that bit? The universe created itself. What could that possibly mean? People have difficulty, you know, I mean, after all, if I say X creates Y, it means that if you've got X, you'll get Y somehow. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, it seems to me it means that nonsense remains nonsense no matter who writes it, even a scientist. It is absurd, and that concerns me. This is not clear intellectual exposition of a theory. This is sheer obfuscation by speaking absurdities. And if that's what you have to resort to get rid of God, well, then you're going to a pretty desperate length, in my view. So there are huge problems with Hawking's ideas here. There are various levels of self-contradiction. But then I stumbled on something else. You see, and this is a very famous cartoon of two physicists and loads of mathematics on the left and loads of mathematics on the right, and one writes on the blackboard, then a miracle occurs to get you from the left to the right. And the other man says wisely, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Filling a gap with a miracle is no good for natural science or mathematics. And that's led to the notion of the god of the gaps. And I illustrate here with a Greek god of lightning, let's say. Now, if you came up to this university to study atmospheric physics and you were a firm believer in the Greek god of lightning, I suspect that belief would disappear halfway through the first lecture. You would discover that you don't need a god of lightning. Disappears when the science fills the gap. Yes? That's what we mean by a god of the gaps. Now, to my astonishment, I discovered that many of the people that I debate with from time to time, or used to when I was younger, many of those people, they thought that I believe in a god of the gaps. And then it suddenly dawned on me why they said, you've got to choose between God and science. That's what many young people and students and even professors come to me and say, why do I have to choose between God and science? Well, it's the wrong God you're thinking of. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then of course you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic, because that's the way you define God. If you define God to be a big mystery that sorts out that problem until science does, then you've got to choose between God and science. But that's not the God of the Bible. I hope some of you here have at least once in your lives read the first sentence of the Bible. It goes like this. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe that we don't yet understand. Oh, you have read it. Of course it doesn't. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is, he created the whole show. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. And of course, it's the bits we do understand that elevates, those of us who are Christians at least, our worship of him. Newton, when he discovered this intricate law of gravity, which I loved teaching to students, just watching these things fall out, the elliptic form of the orbits of the planets and all this kind of stuff. He didn't say, wonderful, I have a law of gravity, I don't need God. No. He said, what a wonderful God who did it that way. That's the way your mind works too, isn't it? The more you know about art, the more you see in the genius of Rembrandt, not the less. And similarly with engineering and every other field. And so it is here. So the God of the Bible is the God of the whole show. But then there's another thing, thinking about the beginning. Hawking's book's called The Grand Design. Have you thought about that? Why he called it The Grand Design? Since he doesn't believe in one. No, he doesn't believe in one, but he sees one. This is the most interesting thing. He sees one. I see one too, but let's come to what he sees. Our universe and its laws appear to have a design. etc., etc., etc. And then he talks about the fact that's not easily explained, and the discovery of extreme fine-tuning of so many laws could lead at least some of us back to the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. 3 points there. First of all, the old idea. Do you notice what the pressure there is to do? C.S. Lewis has a lovely phrase for this. He calls it chronological snobbery. Because an idea is old, it's therefore wrong. Well, I'm old, so I'm probably wrong as well. But why should an old idea be wrong? I taught the very same mathematics, more or less, when I started than when I finished 40 years later. Not all the old ideas are wrong. This is just simply a mistake, and it's a chronological prejudice. But the next thing is, it could lead some of us back to that idea that the grand design is the work of a grand designer. Indeed it could, and indeed it does, and I'm one of them. That is not the answer of modern science. Incorrect. It's not the answer of some modern scientists. It's the answer of many modern scientists. But what is his answer? There's no creator. How do you know that? Because there are many universes. But how's that an argument for no creator? I wrote to Stephen Hawking's co-worker, Don Page, who's written 8 or 9 papers with him, brilliant Canadian mathematician. And I said, tell me, Stephen Hawking's multiverse theory, M theory, that he says is the theory that Einstein was looking for, and Roger Penrose says isn't. So there's a little bit of dispute there. I said, how does it affect your belief in God? Because Don Page believes it. This is his letter to me. Even if M theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't yet, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe. God can create any number of universes if he wants to. So again, we're dealing with false logic. Either or, when they're not mutually exclusive alternatives. Let's take a Nobel Prize winner now. Arno Penzias. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe made out of nothing with the precise fine-tuning which is necessary for life and which has, one might say, an underlying supernatural plan. That's what he concludes from the fine-tuning. And it's what I conclude as well. There's something you can see. It's a perception. And the most sensible, as far as I'm concerned, explanation of the perception is that there is a God behind it. And that's why there are so many books with these titles, The Grand Design, because they can see it. And people agree that they see it too. It's a question of how you interpret it, naturalistically or theistically. And then the last thing in the 3 is explanation. You see, one of the big problems in the debate is, I've got an explanation. We just read one, M theory. Therefore, there's no God. Or there's a law of gravity. And that means the universe can create itself. But just a minute. What do laws explain? I was taught the law of gravity at school. I loved it, but I wasn't taught it correctly. Because, you know, if I'd been asked when I was a boy, what does the law of gravity explain? Guess what I would have said? Gravity. And I'd have been wrong. The one thing the law of gravity does not explain is gravity. Nobody knows what gravity is. And if you don't agree with me, ask Feynman. You see, the law of gravity gives us a mathematical way of brilliantly working out forces between massive bodies. It doesn't tell you what gravity is, and Newton realized that. Now, that's important because if someone comes along and says, well, I'm a naturalist because science explains everything, the answer is it rarely ever explains even within science. Now, that's a partial answer. The next thing is that there are different levels of explanation. Why is the water boiling? Because it's being heated, the molecules of water are being agitated, and that's why it's boiling. Well, yes, but it's boiling because I just love a cup of Irish tea. Now, you laugh politely. But you see, even a ripple of laughter tells me something about you. It means, you see, I'm being slightly ridiculous. Because I've offered you two explanations of the boiling water, and they're both right. They don't compete. They don't conflict. They complement. Now, this is hugely important. If, on the ordinary level of life, explanation comes at different levels, it's true at the level of the universe. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation for the motor car. That's so simple, I find kids can understand it. But I'm concerned about some professors who say the only way is the scientific way. That is clearly false. Now, there's one little thing to add to that, because we're often taught in the natural sciences that explanation to be real goes from the simple to the complex. You explain complex things in terms of simple things. And Richard Dawkins has made this statement: as designer God cannot be used to explain organized complexity, because any God capable of designing anything would have to be complex enough to demand the same kind of explanation in his own right. That sounds terrific until you apply it to Dawkins. I mean, his book, The God Delusion, it's quite complex. And it's organized complexity. So how are we going to explain the organized complexity of Dawkins' book? Well, somebody came to me and said the way to explain it is by Richard Dawkins himself. But I say that's impossible according to this argument, because Richard Dawkins is infinitely more complex than the book. Got it? It sounds good, but it actually is nonsense. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, whenever you see language, as in Dawkins' book, the explanation will always be more complex than the thing sitting in front of you. You are looking at language up behind there, at least I hope you are. And you understand it. It's semiotic, the marks on the screen. And immediately you postulate a mind behind that. Actually, the mind of Richard Dawkins, which is infinitely more complex than what's up there. When we see language, we induct upwards, not downwards. And that is a very important intuition. Language-like complexity is not to be reduced to simple physics and chemistry, as many materialists and naturalists would like. Finally, in this little thing, to give you time for questions, I talked about scientists' faith. And I often ask myself, why do I trust my mind to do mathematics? Well, I usually didn't, so I got my colleagues to check all the stuff I did. And of course, we have to do that. Peer review is the important thing. But the point is, we're trusting our minds to do mathematics. Or maybe we're not trusting our minds because we don't believe in the mind. We're pure materialists. Well, that's all right. Because I often ask my colleagues at Oxford and elsewhere, what do you do science with? And it's wonderful to watch people hesitate. They say, I do it with my, and they're about to say mind, when they remember that's not politically correct, that they're not supposed to believe in the mind. So they say, I do it with my brain. I say, that's fine. Tell me about your brain. What is the brief history of your brain, Professor X? Well, the brief history of my brain is that it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I said, isn't that interesting? And you trust it. You trust it. Well, tell me. Now, I've asked many scientists this. If you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? I've always had the answer directly, no. And then I say, I see you have a problem. Now, this is important, because science depends on that trust. And sometimes they are open enough with me to say, where did you get that argument? Because there's something about me that seems to indicate I could never have thought of an argument like that. And I admit that, ladies and gentlemen, I never did think about it, but Charles Darwin did. And they say, what? Darwin? Yes, I said, read it. Well, here it is. But then with me, the horrid doubt arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, that argument has now been elevated by several people, but notably Thomas Nagel, a brilliant philosopher. But look at the title of his book. It caused absolute chaos in cyberspace. You can see endless discussion, even of the title. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. I never thought I'd live to see a title like that. And his reasoning is to do with this problem, that if you are a reductionist naturalist, you're undermining a basis for trusting human rationality. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So just summing up one or two things. You see, I differentiated briefly between materialism and naturalism. And we came to the idea that once we see language, we recognize mind. And of course, we've lived to see an information-bearing macromolecule. So there's a linguistic-like structure on DNA. And of course, it raises the question that I raised earlier. Now, I'm going to skip over a few things because you can ask about them. But to be fair to how I introduced this talk, the creation, according to the biblical worldview, is fascinating because it prioritizes mind and word. In the beginning was the Word. It's a very profound statement. So it's not in the beginning was nothing, or empty space, or a quantum vacuum. It's in the beginning was the Word. And then the world is built up by a sequence of speech acts and God said, which means, as I understand it, that the universe is not a closed system of cause and effect. It's an open system into which God injects information and energy. And so that brings us to the biggest claim of all, in a way, and that is the Word that created and gave us a mathematically dependable universe and the capacity to do science and everything else. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But Stephen Hawking and Dawkins and everybody else will stop us there. They'll say miracles are a step too far. And Hawking says this book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies that the answer is there are no miracles, nor exceptions to the laws of nature. Scientific determinism, he says, is the basis of all modern science. And to conclude with, I'll quote Lewis again. The first fact in the history of Christendom is a number of people who say they've seen the resurrection. If they had died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no gospels would ever have been written. So there's the tension between naturalism and Christian theism. Can we believe in God in a naturalistic world? Can we believe in a science in a naturalistic world? Well, many do. Yet atheism raises doubts about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science. Ah, but you say, I haven't answered the question about miracles. Well, the clock has stopped, so I'm going to stop, but if you want to ask it, you know what to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you. We are now going to take some questions. First, a bit information, maybe in Norwegian. Så dere vet det, dette foredraget og nå denne runden med spørsmål blir filmet. Så hvis noen der ikke liker å ha bakhodet på TV, eller hvis noen tror de har blitt filmet og ikke vil være på internett, så si fra til meg etterpå. På vei ut etter spørsmål så ligger det en bok av Lennox nå oversatt til norsk. 2 bøker, så dere kan kikke på de på vei ut. Og hvis dere vil høre mer av Lennox, så skal han også holde et foredrag i morgen på Mediehøgskolen Gimmelkollen, og lørdag også på Veritas-konferansen i Grimstad. Spør internett om mer informasjon. Now we're going to have some questions.
I understand.
Yeah, I'll start by gathering 4 questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody, you see, in a room like this is interested in other people's questions. So I'm going to write down 4 before I think of any. So we've got a spectrum to think about, not just one.
Og dere har hørt det sagt, det finnes ikke dumme spørsmål, det sant. Jeg sier dere, det finnes ikke lange spørsmål. Så still korte spørsmål.
So keep the questions to the topic, keep them short, and I'll write them down. So put up your hand so he can see you.
Noen spørsmål?
Don't all rush at once.
Og gjerne høye hender så jeg kan se dem.
Yeah. Methodological naturalism. Is that correct English? Is that a correct view to look upon origin sciences, origin of cosmos, life and humans and so on?
So what is your question? Sorry?
Is that everything has a natural explanation? Is that a correct view to look upon origin sciences, or cosmos, life and humans and so on?
Okay. Number 1, number 2.
This question was regarding the quote of Dawkins that you showed. I gather him to mean that all explanations must, in the fundamentals, be simple explanations. So, but you, I feel like you portray God as a complex explanation. So my question is God, in your view, simple or complex?
Okay, thank you. Number 3.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture.
That's very kind of you.
I have one question about miracles, and you said you might get question of it.
I did say that, yes.
What about the evolution theory and Genesis in the Bible?
What about them?
Is it so that you interpret everything to be metaphorical? And where goes the limit? And how do you then explain the genealogy mentioned from Adam and Eve?
Okay, that's enough questions.
Okay.
That's about 5
Thank
questions. But there wasn't a question about miracles. What's your question about miracles?
Well, it was the creation and
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay, right.
all the other miracles in the Bible, of course, also.
Okay, and all the others, right. About 6 questions. Number 4, please.
Okay, so my question is, since you talked about whether the world has been created or not by God, then my question is, who created God?
Oh, very good. Who created God? Shall we take another one? How long? If you have to leave for the number 10 bus, of course, go. But I can go more than 4. Here's one lady right down here. She deserves a chance. Or one person down here. I haven't. No, it's it. Okay, I've got you.
Yes,
now.
I wonder, do you have some thoughts on the relationship between miracles, or firstly God, miracles, and the laws of nature that science can postulate?
I do indeed.
That you would like to
yes,
share?
okay, right, okay, thank you. Right, is that enough for the minute?
For the minutes, yeah.
Okay, right. Let's have a look at these. As I wrestled with this first question, is it the correct use, naturalism as an explanation? Let me say this, the dominant, as far as I can see, the dominant philosophy in the academy, in many parts, particularly of the Western world, is a naturalistic philosophy. And that is pushing hard towards the idea that creation is something intrinsic to whatever we call the universe or the multiverse. That there's no transcendence, there's no outside. And that's what distinguishes naturalism and materialism on one side and theism on the other. There is no transcendence. Everything is happening. You see, C.S. Lewis wrote many wonderful books, but he did dedicate part of his book on miracles to the concept of natura. What is natural? And he made the very important point that what is natural is what goes on of its own accord. And he gives some lovely examples, of which the one I like best is the dog in his natural state is covered with fleas. In other words, a dog will be covered with fleas unless you intervene to do something about it. So a naturalistic theory of the universe is saying it all comes about of its own accord. There's no intervention from an outside authority or power. That's all I'm going to say. Let me just say that this is a Q&A. Now that means it's totally inadequate. Why? Because you ask me questions. How am I going to react to them? By looking up stuff here? No, I'm not. How am I going to react to them? Except from the top of my head. So all I can give you is a brief approach as to how I would think of tackling your question. And you won't be satisfied. I hope you won't be satisfied. Because if you've asked a real question this afternoon and you're not just testing what I know, that sometimes happens. I know it wouldn't happen here, but it sometimes happens. Then you'll go home and back to the university library and you will start finding answers for yourself. And those are the ones that you really learn from. So I'm happy I don't have a lot of time to answer questions. And my suggestions might even be wrong. But if anything impels you to be a questioning person, I'll be the one to encourage it. Okay, off we go from the rest of it. Now, is God simple or complex? Yes. All depending on what you might mean by those words. But let me go back to the analogy, you see. Dawkins was suggesting God was complex, and in any meaning of the word, I find difficulty with the philosophers defining God as simple. His created images are far from simple, like Dawkins and me. And I think the point that's being made there is that Dawkins thinks that you can't have God as an explanation because he's a higher level of complexity than the thing you're explaining. But his argument is false because there are so many things. To explain that on the left-hand corner, source, no signal, you have to explain that, you have to introduce an engineer of much higher complexity than that. That's the nature of things. If you find a cave drawing, very simple, but to explain it, you'll have to introduce perhaps a race of hitherto unknown humans. Infinitely more complex, but you're not doing nothing because your next question will be, well, what do we know about them? And so in the present case, I would say, right, what's going to explain Dawkins is ultimately God, because he's made in God's image. Well, what do we know about God? Well, let's see if there's any evidence about God. And then I come to the full, what I call the full wonder of the Christian revelation, which, though it doesn't tell us everything about God, it shows us enough about God to enable us to get to know him, and that's a huge thing. So you can make progress up this chain without getting every last bit of knowledge from it. Okay, that's 2. Now, who created God? That is one of Dawkins' questions. I used to meet it in Russia, you know, in Siberia, but never in the West, until Dawkins thought he'd pick up what schoolboys have asked for centuries. If you believe that God created the universe, you have to ask, who created God? Well, let's analyze it logically. That's one step of abstraction. Who or what created X? Now, philosophers talk about complex questions, and here's another misuse of the word complex. But it's complex in that it hides something. If I say, who created X? I'm hiding an assumption. What's the assumption? That X is created. If you say, who or what created X, you're assuming X is created. So if you ask, who or what created God, you're assuming God's created before you start. But what if he isn't? Your question doesn't apply. And of course, therefore, your question doesn't apply to the biblical God, because he is uncreated and eternal. And Dawkins asked me that publicly, and I made that point to him, but I went on a little bit. And I said to him, you think that's a valid question? It is, of course, a valid question for created things. So let me try it on you, Richard. You believe God, you believe the universe created you. Who created your creator on the basis of your question? 10 years ago, was it? 11, I asked him. I still haven't had an answer. And of course I haven't, because he's not prepared to apply the question, oddly and ironically, in the place where it actually works. And stepping back one level more, what we're really asking is, do the questions always go back forever? Or do they stop? I find for most people they stop. My atheist friends, they stop. Where do they stop? Either with nothing, or the multiverse, or something like that. For me, where do they stop? With God. They stop somewhere on both sides. They don't go on forever. So the question is not, do the questions stop? The question is, where do they stop? In other words, what is the ultimate reality in which they do stop? So that's that. Let's see. What do you think of evolution and Genesis? What do you think of all these miracles? What do you think of all that marvelous stuff? Well, I think a great deal about it. So much so. Take 2 questions, one, and I'll be as brief as possible. The first question is, what do I think of Genesis? Rather a lot. That's why I've just had a book, and the folks here, right here, have kindly translated it into Norwegian. And that's wonderful, because I don't have to answer the question now. The book is available. This is a seriously large question, and I take it seriously. So I've written a little book called 7 Days That Divide the World, to try and go into the ins and outs and be fair to the arguments and help you think through it. The worst thing to try to do with this question is try and give you a 2-minute answer, because you'll not agree with it. And instead of generating light, we might just generate some heat. So that's the neat answer to that question. Do forgive me for shameless advertising. But your other question, and that is the business of miracles. Hawking says no miracles. Dawkins says no miracles. The last time anybody could believe in the miracles was about the 18th century, he claims. It's very odd, you know, because people at a much higher level in science in our country than Dawkins do believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Sir John Houghton, head of the Met Office, Sir Brian Heap was vice president of the Royal Society, and I can list a whole load of them. I find it very odd making these wide, sweeping statements. Now, the question is this, and I'm going to be very brief here, actually, because I think, in a sense, it's easy to find your way into this. Where's it all coming from? It's coming from David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And David Hume wrote something like this. I've closed the quote, so I'll have to just remember it, that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. Now, if you go to the United States, there's that awful towing notice that's on every street and every corner, so you don't know where to park. Towers will be violated or something like that. And you're not allowed to park, so they'll tow you away because you've violated a law. Now, here's where the problems start. We use the word law in English, and I suspect in Norwegian, for two very different things. One are the laws of the country, and the other are the laws of nature. If you break the laws of the country, you'll find yourself in difficulty. If you break the laws of nature, well, what would that mean? And I think, again, here, C.S. Lewis enlightened me many years ago, and it was just like fresh water to read his book on miracles. He points out the confusion. Laws, in the scientific sense, are not causes. The laws of Newton never moved a football in the history of the universe. Do you know that? You footballers. Footballers move footballs, not the laws of nature. The laws of nature, Newton's laws, will describe the motion, at least a little bit of it. But it won't cause the motion. That's a huge mistake. The laws describe what normally happens. It'll describe how the billiard ball goes across the table, provided nobody lifts it off the table. But the law can't prevent somebody lifting it off the table. That would be ridiculous. The laws describe, but they don't constrain. Now, come to the higher level. I've been staying in a hotel in Oslo. So I go to bed 2 nights ago, and I put, let's say, £100 in the drawer. And the next night I put another £100 in the drawer. That's 200. And on the third morning I open the drawer and there are £50 in the drawer. Now, what do I conclude? One, the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Norway. Which do I conclude? Which? Norway. How do I know that? Because, ladies and gentlemen, the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Do you see that? This is just so simple, this kind of argument. And the greatest interpreter of David Hume, Anthony Flew, I met him sometime before he died, said he'd been wrong about Hume. Hume was wrong about the laws of nature for many reasons. But the point is that the laws of nature are not like the laws of the country. It's the knowledge of the law of arithmetic that hasn't been broken that tells me that somebody put their hand in, other than my wife, of course, that somebody put their hand in, and that my mistake was to think that the drawer was a closed system of cause and effect, when it wasn't. Now, just widen the analogy to the universe. Naturalism tells us the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. It isn't. And there are marks within history, notably at the resurrection of Jesus, that there's a Lord over creation who can feed new events in. They don't break the laws of nature at all. And that's enormously important because, you see, that removes the objection to a miracle in principle. But then you have to ask the other question, and that is this: how can I know that Jesus really rose from the dead? Now, that's another question, and I'm sure you've many lectures to answer that, and I have a huge website. Just in particular on that topic, I gave a lecture at Harvard on this, and you can see that, veritas.org, on why I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that is all I've got the energy for. But what I'd like to say to you is a very big thank you for inviting me. The reason I do these things, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely because I think it's unfair that the general public, and students in particular, never hear, or very rarely hear, arguments that are not based on naturalistic assumptions. So I've tried to be fair. I read all these people and all this kind of thing. And I presented before you some arguments I hope that you will think about and think carefully about. But of course, if it is true that the naturalistic view of the universe is false, and there is a God, not only is there a God who's created the universe and gifted us as human beings to do many marvelous things, but has come to visit our planet, it would be a seriously important thing to ask why he's come. And the reason given is that he's come to give us a different kind of life. That ought to resonate with people. One of the most important burgeoning subjects in university campuses throughout the world is, what is the good life? And what Christ says is that he's come to give life and to give it abundantly, but he's going to do something that no utopian thinking ever faces and therefore never succeeds. He's going to deal with the problem of our own personalities and messes we made of life, ruining other people's lives than our own. There is no road to paradise, let me be blunt about it, without facing the question of human sin. And the reason I'm a Christian here, not just a theist or a deist, is very simple. It's because Jesus Christ offers me something nobody else does. He doesn't compete with anybody, for obvious reasons. Because he offers me now, if I'm prepared to receive him, turn away from the mess of my own life and receive him as Savior and Lord, he'll give me forgiveness on the spot. Forgiveness is a big thing, folks. He'll give me peace with God, and he'll give me a new power to live. I don't find that anywhere else. And that, in the end, is the reason that pours into everything else I do. And it also adds a glow to my intellectual interest, because God is so big. He loves us enough to give us minds to research his universe rather than clamping them down. But with those few thoughts, I leave you. Thank you very much.